Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is Dan Lizette, and this is episode 126. Thank you all so much for coming back to join me. Got a great conversation for you to lend your ears to, and hopefully to subscribe to a brand new show. But before we get started, just want to take a quick moment and thank a couple of groups of people who make this thing happen. First are, of course, my Patreon supporters. There's a link in the show notes, folks, to Patreon. If you don't know what it is, it's a chance for you, the avid, rabid listener of the Podcast Digest, to support me in this endeavor directly with as little as $1 a month. And there are a number of people on there who are doing just that, and I very much appreciate each and every one of them. I also really much appreciate this week's show sponsor, again, returning, and I appreciate it so much as well. Podbean is back. Podbean is bringing you this week's show. They offer podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to start podcasting, really. If you go to podbean.com/TPD, you'll learn more, and you'll get your first month for free, and I'm going to tell you more about Podbean in just a little while. But let's get on to episode 126. Really excited about this one, guys. It's very unique in the catalog here on the Podcast Digest for a lot of different reasons. First, let's say, is I'm featuring a show super early in the run. At the time of recording, there are only 2 episodes out there in addition to a little preview, which is super early. But you're going to hear me describe exactly why and how this came to be. The first reason is, and I mentioned this early on in our conversation, is Sophie Harper from Not by Accident, which is a former guest and a spectacular documentary-style podcast that has recently joined Wondery. If you're not checking out Not by Accident or Wondery, you're listening to podcasts wrong. Trust me, you should be doing that. But Sophie started tweeting about this show, and I realized, hey, if Sophie likes something, I probably need to jump on over and listen. And I did, and I was blown away by what I heard, especially for such a new show to be in such a advanced state of production value and storytelling, and I was really intrigued super early. And one of the reasons is that I had an actual personal connection to the story being told. I don't want to give away because I talk about it a little bit later. And without further ado, my guest is Sam Sabin from Good Grief is the name of the show, a documentary-style podcast that is a phenomenal listen. You've just got to listen to what Sam is doing to really get a full taste. So we go over it all in the conversation, and I don't want to give it away. I just want to thank you all for taking a listen and for supporting the show and tweeting about it and sharing it on your Facebook page and telling all your friends that if somebody's getting into podcasting, they should check out the Podcast Digest. It really humbles me when you do that, and I really appreciate it. So let's jump into our conversation this week with my guest, Sam Sabin from Good Grief. Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week is Sam Sabin from Good Grief, a brand new show that I really want to learn more about, and I hope you guys will check out. But first, I wanted to just tell a quick story about how I came across this show, and I wanted to wait to now so that I make sure that Sam could hear it. You guys may remember way back when I featured an interview with Sophie Harper, who is an Australian podcaster who is telling a great story in sort of a documentary style. And since her and I last spoke, which was, I'm looking back in the history now, episode 95, last summer, June 12th, 2016, I released episode 95. She's gone on to some great things with her show, and it's been really well received and critically acclaimed, as I feel that it should be. Well, I say all that because Sophie started tweeting about another show and was impressed herself, so I knew I had to check it out. And that is Sam Sabin and Good Grief. So with that as a background, Sam, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me, and thanks for coming on to talk about this super unique show. I'm drawing a parallel, but only in sort of the idea of documentary, but that's sort of where the similarities end. So before we jump in talking about the show, though, let's talk a little bit about you. For folks who are not familiar with you, Sam, can you tell folks a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess prior to the podcast, I was a recent UNC grad. I graduated in May, very business journalism focused, very much into the idea of covering solely business news and things like that. And radio and audio just kind of wasn't on my radar at all. I'm also I'm from North Carolina, from Charlotte. Love North Carolina so much. But yeah, I guess before this, I was mostly just a print reporter covering whatever people threw at me and weird feature stories and all that jazz. Spent all this time on my college newspaper and things like that. But yeah, I don't know. I just kind of stumbled into audio and I haven't really looked back, I guess. So yeah.
Well, would you maybe this isn't even a fair question, but I'll throw it out there. Has this experience already potentially created a shift for you in what you might want to do moving forward, or is it too early to say?
Well, it might be. So I'm also right now I have a day job where I cover technology. So from 9 to 6, I'm at a small media startup, covering it. And then I kind of come home and do my audio and my creative stuff. And I've always kind of had an artistic background. So I did art high school and middle school. I was in an art frat. So I've always been someone who's kind of needed a creative outlet outside of my day job or whatever I'm doing throughout the day. So I don't know if it's really created a shift or it's created this really important outlet for me when I come home after, calling people all day, talking about their startups and technology and different business things and funding. It's kind of nice to come home and just focus on this story and focus on how I'm going to craft it and how to add music to it or which quotes I'm going to use or things like that. So I don't know if it's really created a shift per se. I think it's just opened up this new outlet for me to put my creative energy into. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I've always said that I think a lot of podcasters are part of my listenership, and I think a lot of people can appreciate the idea of, myself included, the day job and then coming home and working on your your creative outlet project. So can appreciate that. But we've talked a lot about the show. Let's give folks who haven't checked it out, because at the time of this recording, we only have a preview and 2 episodes at the time of our recording. So folks may not have yet heard about this. So before we get in and talk a lot about the details, give folks a little bit of idea of the premise.
Yeah. So Good Grief is a serialized audio documentary podcast about myself and kind of what I did after I learned about my Mohawk ancestry. So I'm a quarter Mohawk. Always knew that I was a quarter Native, and it's always been kind of weird in my family currently because everyone else is white as can be, blonde hair or light brown hair complexions, and I have a slightly tanner look. I was the one who didn't get sunburnt. And so I found out what exactly it meant to be a quarter Native and that Mohawk ancestry by reading about it in my estranged father's obituary. And so this is kind of a podcast or a show about what I did after that and how I kind of tackled those questions and how I tackled what it meant to actually know what it means to be Native and how you handle that when you grow up in a very white household. Yeah.
So on episode 1, Sam, you pretty much open up the narrative and the story with the call from your mom, letting you know that your dad had passed.
Yeah.
Was that sort of the event that triggered everything else around Good Grief, or had you already had maybe in the back of your mind exploring this topic or potentially going down the road of a documentary style podcast, or was all of this sort of happening after that phone call?
Yeah. I mean, before that phone call, I, of course, my biological father was not really in my life. So before that phone call, of course, I always had those moments where I was like, one day I'll confront him. One day I'll ask all these questions, but I didn't really have anything to propel me and actually make me do it. And so I guess that phone call for me, I didn't walk out of it going, I'm going to make a podcast.
That would be a little odd.
Idea, exactly. But the idea for the podcast kind of came a year afterwards. And that phone call really just kickstarted all these questions. And so I think knowing that I couldn't ask him specifically made me want to know the answers more. And and kind of trying to figure out what it meant for him to not be in my life, why he wasn't there. And then I think it was in that week when I found his obituary, and it's like in the first paragraph, it says a few things about his Native ancestry. And then I remember I immediately started like Googling like who the St. Regis Mohawk tribe is, what it means, where they're located. And I was like trying to think of all these things to like go visit them and kind of learn about it. But I think that phone call probably kickstarted a lot of what ended up turning into the podcast specifically. But the idea for the show didn't come until maybe a year later.
So what was that process like when you decide that this journey will be documented? What's that thought process like?
Well, for me, I also was a creative writing minor. I've always been attracted to nonfiction works. And I guess, as like a 20-something figuring out her creative outlet, like I'm always drawn to my own stories and memoir-esque stuff. So it wasn't really daunting to think about the fact that everyone's going to hear about this, because I'm already used to writing about my own stuff and sharing it in different outlets or groups or whatever. But the idea for the show itself kind of came when I found an opportunity through the UNC Creative Writing Program. They offer a summer travel grant for creative writing students, and usually you apply, and you have to apply with a clear project idea. And I knew I wanted to go to the tribe and to the reservation, but I didn't have a clear idea as to like what this project would look like. I remember having like a vague idea of like, it'd be really cool if I did like an oral history-esque like project to hear these people and whoever I talked to on the reservation, to hear them tell their own stories and kind of hear their voices. I don't know why I was so attracted to the idea of hearing them tell it. But I was so stuck, and then I just went to a few of my professors, and one of them, she had coincidentally just done a whole book on that exact Mohawk tribe. So she had connections. So she was helping me plan a trip and how to budget for the trip, for this grant. And then another professor, I had her, for another kind of audio storytelling kind of thing. We were just in a weird creative writing class where we didn't really write. We just did live storytelling, or she would have us create like a This American Life podcast episode in 2 weeks, and all of us don't know how to work a recorder. She's like, listen to it, good luck. And we're like, oh my God, please don't. But I knew she would probably be the one who could help me with the format for the project. And I stumbled in and I was like, hey, Joy, here's my idea. Here's what I want to do. I'm really drawn to audio. And she was like, well, Sam, why don't you just do something like Serial, but about figuring out who your dad is? And I think the moment she said that is the moment I was like, Joy, we are doing this. You just like,
the light bulb went off.
Yeah. Exactly. She was like, I remember leaving and she was like, don't you ever say I didn't do anything for you. And I was like, that's a really weird thing to say. But now like, she really changed a lot of things for me. Cause this project probably wouldn't be a thing without going to her at office hours. So I think it was really through conversations with people in my like network at school, just from talking to people who knew me intimately from my own work and talking to friends. And I don't know, it's one of those things where once you have a good idea, you can't really shake it. You just have to do it and see what happens.
Were you already a podcast listener? We mentioned Not by Accident, and there's several others. You mentioned Serial. Were there any ones that you thought that approach or that style might work for what I want to do?
Yeah, so the weird thing is that I wasn't a big podcast listener until I started doing my own podcast, which I was like, I don't know how I stumbled into it. It's still very weird how this happened.
No, I think that's great, because that means you're coming to it with fresh eyes, right? You're not necessarily trying to do a knockoff of anyone else's effort.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only podcast I truly listened to before I started actually working on mine and trying to listen to others for to see examples and things was Startup. I listened to that because I had a technology reporting internship, and everyone was like, have you heard of Startup? And I was like, oh, this is cool. Right. And then also like season 1 of Serial. I can't even remember if season 2 was out by then or if I was just super behind. But yeah, I think those were the only 2 that I had like consistently listened to. And so it wasn't until I actually started working on my own and realizing how overwhelmed I was by the idea of making my own podcast. Then I think that was around May. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. There's so many options. What can I do? And of course, I'd listened to a few like This American Life episodes and Radio Lab, but I wasn't like a hardcore listener by any means. But I think that's when it was around the time that Millennial got picked up by Radiotopia that I found it, because all these articles were coming out about it. And I was like, oh, it's like startup, but for like when you're in your 20s. It's like how all the news articles were describing it. And so that's when I kind of started listening to Millennial, and that kind of became a gateway to find all these other kind of similar style podcasts about yourself and kind of very documentary, serialized formats. And I think those are the ones that really kind of helped me to find my own way of doing it and my own voice and figure out my own story and things like that.
I got to tell you, there's something intriguing to me about this genre. I mean, you might be the fifth or sixth falling under this category that I've talked to over these last couple of years. And I think there's always a resonance with this. I'm going to guess because of its, usually very personal nature. Do you think that's why there tends to be a listenership for these type of shows? Or in your experience so far, do you think maybe there's another reason?
I don't know. That's a tough question. I think for me, because I've been to a bunch of live storytelling events as well, and I've done my fair share of like Moth-esque storytelling. And so I think for me, what I think people are really drawn to by stories is the empathy that you gain from it. I find that I'm hearing new perspectives in the way that the intimate nature of these stories are just helping me to gain a new perspective about like in the world. I'm learning more about where other people are coming from and how they tackle struggles and how we might be similar or how we might be completely different, but we end up in similar places. And so I think it's that learning aspect that I think really draws me into it. And I don't know if it's similar for other people. I get different responses about the premise of my show all the time. There are people who talk about how they're grieving as well and how they have complicated griefs, or they kind of talk about that aspect of, well, I just found out that I'm like a quarter Italian or a quarter Polish or a quarter whatever. And they go through that route. So I think I think it's different for different people as to why they're so drawn to these personal narratives. And I think that might also be the draw of it, is you never know what you're going to gain from this story or how you're going to find a connection, or empathize with the storyteller in that way. Yeah, whether or not there's another reason, I don't know. That's a good.
You know what? I love your answer. I think you nailed it.
Yeah.
Right? There are a whole bunch of reasons why somebody may draw a particular connection out of somebody's story, and I think you just hit it, because in yours is an interesting one, right? Somebody may create that empathy or that self-identification and that interest in the story you're telling because they're either grieving or if they found something out about their history, or maybe it's just more. I was thinking that yours is especially interesting. One of the wrinkles in sort of what you're doing is that I this is completely a bad parallel, but I'm going to try to make it anyways here. Previously, I spoke with David Ridgen from Someone Knows Something, and from CBC Radio, and it's a crime investigative thing. And one of the things he does is that he's in the car, he's got his recorder, he's physically traveling to places to kind of find things to piece a story together. And while crime and what you're doing are completely different, I can hear some similarities because he's taking us through a serialized journey to learn things, and in some ways that's sort of what you're doing. You're bringing us along literally on site, on location, talking to people, piecing together a story. And I think that there's that angle of appeal as well, right? Somebody kind of, where does this end, right? What's going to happen next? What is Sam going to continue to learn, and how's she going to react to it? Yeah.
It's also funny because I have an investigative journalism background as well. Exactly. So this show really just combines a lot of my favorite outlets and things. It's like an investigative thing where I'm also like a little artistic and like crafting my own story. And that's my favorite thing about making it.
And let's not forget your amateur karaoke skills.
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
in there too. Let's go back in the timeline just a little bit here, Sam. You talked about how, so you've got this idea, you're interested in the audio, but, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you had very little technical background to start, like you said, operating a recorder. So what's that process like now from somebody who's got that investigative journalism background? You've got a story you want to tell. How do you start getting into the world of audio production?
Yeah. So actually a part of the travel grant that I got also funded the equipment costs, and it also funded basically a week-long audio institute at Duke Center for Documentary Studies. And so I benefited in that from the UNCJ school when I was an undergrad. They kind of made you go through the basic video and audio reporting courses. I tend to pick up new softwares pretty easily. I've always been someone where if you stick me in front of a computer, I could probably figure out like all the nuances of it. I just love picking apart technology and new softwares and things like that. So it was pretty easy for me to pick up. When I was in school, we were using Premiere, which you do not use for audio. Right. But I like the technical aspect, so I was pretty comfortable with editing and understanding, like trying to figure out how to mold the sound to what I want to hear, in terms of leveling and clarity and things like that. But in terms of how to craft an audio narrative or how to actually use a recorder or the very specific technical nuances that come with trying to record your narration and make sure that you're in a soundproof area and you're not too muffled, or how to how to equalize things. Who knows? I know now, but so I had a course at Duke, and that's also where I just like made the pilot. And so the idea, they have a week-long institute at the beginning of August, and you essentially show up with all of your recordings and everything, like an idea for a story you want to make for that week. And some people come with like me, they come with, oh, I'm starting a show and I want to work on an episode. And some people are like, well, I made this in the past, but I really want to mold it. And one woman came with she came with an essay and wanted to turn it into an audio piece. And so it's a big variety, but we're all there for like 4 or 5 days for 12 hours a day. We're listening to examples nonstop. We have instructors on site who know how to like use Hindenburg, which is what I use, or Pro Tools or something, and how to help you and just like help you craft it. And they'll read through the scripts with you and go, I don't know if that's right. Doesn't sound great. And you have like small group editing. And so that was really where I felt comfortable asking a lot of my technical questions about like, well, what does this mean? I am brand new. What does it mean to like have to equalize it or having to like compress my audio? What does that even do for me? And things like that. And they're really good about providing shortcuts and tips like that, and kind of looking at my audio equipment and being like, oh no, you're not recording in the right way. You're not recording.
You're not recording.
You should do it this way. Right. Exactly. You're not recording. Try to point it this way if you're having that problem or something like that. And it was kind of through them that I was also able to go to Third Coast in November, through the Air Media, like New Voices scholarship. So when I went there, I still had more questions because it was 2 months later. And so I was producing and I had all these other questions. And so, I showed up there and I was like, hello, experienced producer. I am Sam. Can you tell me what it means to do this? And they're like, perfect. Great. You're new and you're asking questions and this is beautiful. And so I think for me, the greatest lesson I've learned is just not to be afraid of asking questions, even if they seem dumb or stupid. Cause I am new. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I've learned and picked it up. And now I'm like fairly comfortable, but I still run into those problems all the time of like, I record an entire, episode and then I listen back on the narration and I'm muffled all the way through. And I'm like, no, I just spent like 30 minutes having to record that. So I still make those mistakes. Of course, I'm like two and a half episodes in right now. But it's all about asking questions and things like that. I'm by no means a pro right now.
So after the time in the program at Duke, and then you started collecting your own audio, I'm guessing. Would that be the time? That was when the road trip happened, I'm guessing.
Well, no. So the road trip actually happened before then. So I went on my trip in June. I kind of knew just from basics of listening to other people's podcasts and things like that, kind of how to get the best sound, or from reading things on Transom, or any other basics that are there. They're all escaping me right now, but I found a lot of posts about the best ways to do it. And just having that basic training from UNC, it was pretty easy to know, like, bring headphones. Don't be like, tell people like, hi, I'm going to show up with a lot of equipment. Please do not be intimidated. This is for a podcast. And so things like that. I still made like very novice mistakes from that road trip, and things like that. But I knew, just from my own reporting too. So I think in print reporting, we're told the same thing, especially for features, to constantly be writing things down, like write down what color shirt they're wearing, write down like where you're sitting, what they're eating, things like that, especially for feature stories. And so it's that attention to detail that I just kind of translated into recording, just knowing like, I'm on a road trip, I'm talking to myself a lot, I should be recording this just in case I need it. I'm on a road trip, I'm like going to Wendy's and I'm singing about Wendy's. I should be recording this just in case I need it. And things like that. So that kind of translated from my own training, just even as a print reporter, or even a digital reporter, just knowing that I have to pick up all these details because you really never know what you're going to need. And then you hear it in other people's podcasts. Like at the time I was really into millennial. And so knowing that like Megan's just recording everything. And so I'm like, I need to record everything too on this trip. And it was just, the trip was in June. And then I kind of started logging tape for about a month after that. And then I had to go to Duke with all my tape. And I was just like very overwhelmed. I was like, I don't know what a pilot episode is. I don't even have a name for this podcast. I don't really know. And I got really lucky as to like who my instructors were. Cause there are people who were very, very well versed in how to craft like an audio narrative story. And people who were just, who I could still depend on even today to be like, hey, does this sound like crap? Hey, do you like, how does this sound? And things like that. So
just from the trip up north, how much audio do you think you were coming out of that trip with in hours? Ooh. If you had to estimate.
Ooh. Yeah, I know it was not nearly enough.
Oh.
I remember feeling that way. But I remember doing the math. I think it was like 6 hours, maybe 6 to 10. I cannot remember. I haven't totaled it up in a while. And a lot of that was mostly just me rambling, me rambling in the car. There were like me, like, it's because sometimes I'd get really nervous because a lot of the people I was talking to, they were in their 70s. And so they knew I was doing a podcast, but I kind of figured, just from talking with them, like they couldn't figure out their computers. And I was like, I don't want to scare you with my audio equipment. So a lot of times I would just like record it on my cell phone too. So some of the stuff you hear is like recorded through my iPhone, which like the quality of an iPhone still like baffles me. But yeah, so it just really, it depends. So I think maybe 6 to 10 with all the interviews and ramblings and applications and kind of random processes.
So I'm curious now, once you start to sit down with all this, which I'm guessing now we're looking, late summer, early fall of 16 is somewhere in that window?
Yeah. Yeah.
Those who are hopping over to subscribe and listen right now, and folks, I strongly encourage you to do so, are going to hear a lot of the things we've been describing. And the reason that you're saying them and I'm calling them out or what have you is because they're in there, right? You legitimately had to get a takeout pizza through a drive-through window, right? And that's all in there, right? And the amateur karaoke I'm talking, it's all in there. And it's great. I love it because it really, I think, personalized and endears you to the audience because people are like, this is a real person. You know, I would do that type of thing, right? But But there would have been an argument, or I guess maybe a question in your mind at a point. Do those type of things stay or go? I'm kind of curious if you can talk us through what that decision making was like.
Yeah. For me, it's all a gut reaction. So I am someone, I probably overshare way more than like most of my friends. Probably way more than most of the people in my family. I'm so used to just telling people like, I love Wendy's and I love Selena Gomez, and let me tell you why. I love going to like Pizza Hut all the time, things like that. But I think it's really a gut reaction. So there will be things that I do that won't be in the show. Things where maybe that'll come later from conversations with people in my family where I know that they're pretty private. They're things that maybe happened in my family's lives where I'm like, it is not my right to share that. It is not my right to do anything like that. Or it doesn't add value to the show. I think that's also it is, always asking that question of what does this add and what does this do for me? And I have two editors and they're two of my really good friends from college and they both have production backgrounds too. And so I always send them the scripts as well and kind of go, do you think I'm missing something? Do you think this is too much? Do you think, like, do we really need to include the pizza? How are you responding to pizza? And I had one friend, she was very into the pizza. She was like, I think you need to make this more dramatic. And I was like, oh girl, okay, I guess I'm keeping the pizza. She's like, I'm really feeling you at this Pizza Hut. And it's all just a gut reaction, I think. I can usually tell if I'm oversharing and I can usually tell if I'm holding back in some way. And it's in those moments I just had to teach myself not to run away from them if I feel like I'm holding back, to kind of force myself to break through that and talk to my editors or talk to mentors about, like, I give them my first drafts and I ask like, what is missing here? Cause I know I'm holding back, or what is missing here? Cause I think I might be oversharing, and kind of doing it that way. So I guess it's all in feedback and it's all kind of in my own visceral reactions to things. Cause at the end of the day, this is like a show that I'm doing for myself, primarily. So it's like, if I feel weird about it, then the show will probably suffer from it. Right. So it's kind of always taking those moments to check with myself and see, if it fits or how it fits in there and things like that. So.
Hey, folks, let me jump in just a quick moment and tell you about this week's show sponsor. It is my awesome friends over at Podbean. They offer podcast hosting and monetization, and if you are looking to start a show, you really should be considering Podbean. Or if maybe you're not completely happy with your current home for a show, then Podbean's something worth considering. Let me tell you why. A few of the reasons why it is a great place to start a new podcast out. First of all, of course, they've got all your obvious support for RSS and iTunes, right? They can import your show if you're with another host. They could redirect it if you're migrating over. You can actually set up a mobile app through Android or iOS. You're going to get your own website that's fully customizable with themes and colors. You're going to be able to share the show out to all the socials that are so important now for growing your podcast audience, and it'll embed a player as well when you share it. But if you've got your own website, they can work with that too. They can integrate right into your own website. When you join Podbean, you will be a part of their online directory, and they promote shows regularly on their socials, on the front page of their website. So joining the Podbean family has a lot of advantages as well. And of course, the one I always like to talk about, it's almost becoming its own meme at this point, right? Comprehensive podcast statistics, okay? It is a big deal. If you're not hosting your own show yet and you're considering starting one, you'll realize that stats are pretty important. And the reason is that sort of tells you kind of how your show's doing. Is it growing? Are people sort of responding and sharing with their friends? So Podbean will give you all the comprehensive stats that you're looking for. When you're ready to take the show to the next level, Podbean's got you covered there as well. They got tons of integrated monetization tools, right? You can designate episodes or a whole show as premium. You can participate in their advertising platform. All right, seriously, if a lot of podcasters are considering ways to get advertisers, well, Podbean can help you connect with advertisers looking for shows just like yours. And they even offer their own patron program where listeners can support you directly. All of that's a part of Podbean. And if you go to podbean.com/TPD for the Podcast Digest TPD, you're going to get all the details on what I've been telling you about, as well as your first month free if you sign up with that special URL. Do it now, folks. You won't regret it. I promise you. My thanks to Podbean for supporting the Podcast Digest. Now, let's get back to my conversation with Sam. You mentioned your family, Sam, and I love that. Even in the show notes, you're thanking them for allowing you to make them part of this experience. But I'm curious, because that's always one of the things. And I remember when I spoke with Megan Tan from Millennial, I sort of had a similar question for her, which is, what's that process like when you know that to really tell the story, they're going to have to be a part of it, and you obviously have to get their buy-in, and what's that experience been like for you?
So I guess what my family has always known that they have raised a creative type. I cannot imagine that in the back of their minds they didn't think that one day I'd start to include them in a lot of my stuff, and that we'd have disagreements about it and things like that. I think at first there was a lot of hesitation because, of course, when you're talking about when I'm starting to ask questions about, like, why is my father not in my life? Why is he with this other family that I didn't know about? Why is he doing all this stuff? Of course, it's really personal. And it was really personal for my mother. And I think that we had a lot of disagreements about whether or not I could even do this, or how I could go about this, because she was, one, worried about privacy. And worried about, two, also that this would be really focused on their relationship rather than my own story. Right. And so we had a lot of talks about it, or a lot of also arguments about how to do this and where the level is. And I think at the end of the day, it just, when my family knows I'm just going to do what I want to do, which, like.
But ultimately, did Mom come around? It kind of sounds like
yes.
She did.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And then two, I think the conversations always ended with, I trust you. I'm just worried. Right. And then that's why. So right now, my mom listens to all the episodes before they go out. And every email I send her, I'm like, here's a list of things that you might not like that are in this episode. So you know. Exactly.
That's awesome.
And so it did take a while also to get them to actually be interviewed. I was so surprised by that, because once they were like, yeah, you're doing a podcast, I was like, okay, well, you're going to be interviewed, so let's sit down while I'm home, because I live in DC now and they're in North Carolina. And so it's really hard to get them on the phone or to, like, get them in the same room. And so anytime I'm home, I'm like, okay, we're going to interview now. It took my mom maybe 6 months to actually sit down with me. She'd always find an excuse. My favorite excuse was, I don't know, Sam, we sound similar on the phone, so why don't you just record yourself as me and just use that? That was my favorite one. But
that's nice.
She says it jokingly. And it's always, I think a lot of it was always when I'd ask, it's like, when they're about to go out, like when they're about to go do something, it's probably not the best time to talk about really serious things.
Wait a minute. If I remember correctly, Sam, did you nod to that in one of the episodes? Yeah. I was going to say, didn't you do a back and forth, but it was both you?
Oh, I did.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I didn't do a back and forth. So I think it was in the pilot episode. There was like a recording. I was going home for Memorial Day weekend. And I remember I was like, I'm going to do it now. I'm starting this podcast. I got to interview her before I go on my trip. And this is the last time I'll see her before that. And then when I was home, it just never felt right. I hadn't been home in a while. My stepfather, or he's my father, I call him my father, or my dad wasn't home. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity. I was alone with her, but it just never felt right. It's always weird trying to ask my mom about this. Just because it can be so personal. And if I don't phrase a question right, it can be misconstrued as like, why did you do this to me? And I never mean it that way, but it can easily come across that way when you're asking someone like, where was my biological father? Why didn't you ever tell me this? This is all your fault. And it's not her fault. It's just how life plays out. But yeah, it was interesting because then I remember I recorded myself going down to Charlotte, and I recorded myself coming back, and I was like, well, I guess I didn't do it, and I don't really know why I didn't do it. It just never felt right. And I think that plays back to that gut reaction. So I've had a lot of those moments with my own family of knowing when it's appropriate to interview them and record them, and when it's not so appropriate, and maybe I just need to jot it down in a notebook and know that I should write it out in a narration rather than like have the actual thing where they're really emotional. Because it's interesting when we're talking about something like this and we're all really emotional about it. It's interesting to kind of figure out when to record and when not to. And it all plays to that gut reaction type of thing.
There's so many different elements to sort of what you're in the process of doing, whether, we talked a little bit about the family, a little bit about sort of the personal history and heritage component of it, and the grief component of it. So there's so many different things to navigate and manage as you kind of go through this process. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this because there's another reason that we connected today. And I just wanted to mention this a little bit because you talked about the relatability to a listener. I related to this show in an even grander way than probably most, because come to find out, I think your father and my father actually were both part of the same tribe and heritage that you are in the process of unearthing with Good Grief. And it literally blew my mind when I heard things like the St. Regis Reservation and Mohawk and the areas in upstate New York, because that's exactly where I'm from. And so we blew up the concept of small world and connecting with a listener probably more than most. But isn't that one of sort of, it's almost like the home run of doing what you're doing, right? Like almost as good as it gets in terms of drawing a connection with somebody who can really sort of understand what you're doing.
Oh, 100%. I remember you said that. I was like, what are the odds? It's almost like this is even more of a connection than when I found out I had a creative writing professor in North Carolina who spent like 2 years up there. But I was like, what are the odds that someone knows this tribe? And then you messaged me and I was like, what are the odds that someone is from there? It's surreal. It's something I didn't even think about it. Like the chances that people from that area would find this,
right.
And know what I'm talking about. And it's so isolated. It's like isolated in terms of like what I'm used to. So it's like 3 hours from Syracuse and like 2 hours from Montreal. And those are probably like the closest airports from what I can remember. So I had to drive when I was up there. And it's so crazy that someone else also knows about this area. And chances are, about like the 2-lane highway that this entire reservation's off of, and things like that.
Well,
And
you mentioned in one of the episodes about the bridge to Canada, and I grew up a mile from the bridge to Canada in Messina, New York, right there on the St. Lawrence River. Was right where I grew up, and I hopped across that bridge I don't know how many times, going to Canada, pick up this, come back, pre 9/11 when you could do things like that, just kind of hop back and forth. And so it's funny now because when you get into sort of the physical descriptions of the area at a time or two, I can re-see it all in my mind.
The bridge to Canada was so surreal. I knew it was there, but it's just, there's something about driving past it, and it's like probably not even a mile from like the welcome sign to Akwesasne, which is so important, I think, just because they have so many complications with so many different borders running through their land. They have, as you probably know, they have like the Ontario border, they have the Quebec border, and then they're also in New York. And then for a while, they had those county line issues as well in New York, which just causes so many different complications. So there's now, because of that Canadian divide across the reservation, there's like the St. Regis Mohawk tribe is kind of the American side, like official tribal administration, but then you have the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne that kind of regulates that Canadian membership side. So technically I'm only a member of like one half of it, because I'd have to be a Canadian resident, I believe, to even get membership into like the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. And it's just so many different regulations that they have to go through just in their ordinary lives because of that bridge.
It almost might motivate someone, maybe me, only to potentially do a similar research, but it's only because of the large scale complication that you're describing that I'm probably hesitant. I think I may have misspoke a moment ago when I said it's on my dad's side. It's actually on my mom's dad's side with all of this. And so what's interesting is I also had dual citizenship because my father was from the Canadian side up there on these borders we're talking about, and then my mom had the Mohawk portion and the U.S. citizenship. And so it would be wildly complicated. But, I'm going to stay subscribed, Sam, and I'm going to see how this goes for you. And maybe you might motivate me or probably others to embark upon a similar journey.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's also surprisingly easy to at least get a family tree of your own ancestry because you have to have so much proof. And like 3 generations of your family line you have to give to the tribal administration. And so they have those records. So you never know. It could be super easy for you to trace that Mohawk ancestry and at least get some names and figure it out.
And Sam's got this all on her website, folks. Link in the show notes as always. I was looking at it right before we hopped on, and it's like, wow, look at all that information. A lot of blocks, a lot of names, back to like 1800s or earlier in some cases.
Yeah, it's like the 1700s. It's crazy. And of course, the sad thing is that most of them are dead or deceased. So I had to do a little bit more digging to try and find anyone who might still be alive. But yeah, it's so crazy, like what they actually have there. And you never know until you ask. So
absolutely. There's I just wanted to cross that bridge in terms of our conversation, because I think one of the reasons I wanted folks to hear us have that conversation is that I think sometimes all of us have can fall into the trap of, these are just podcasts in our ears and it's just entertainment. I know from having these conversations every single week with all these awesome hosts and creators that it's almost always much more than that, right? And your show is a perfect example of that story, that sometimes a certain story can really hit home for you. And I think it's one of the reasons why everybody should be out there telling their friends and family about podcasting in general, and go find something that's awesome. And I definitely would put Good Grief in that category. So what has the critical response been, so to speak, since launch?
That's a great question. Critical response, I think, has been overwhelmingly positive. So about early last week or the week before, someone from the Bellow Collective, so it's an email newsletter that recommends podcasts, found Good Grief just through Twitter. I don't know if she found it through someone who retweeted me or just from Googling, or for searching for new podcasts or whatever, but she found me and included it in their newsletter. And that led to an uptick of subscribers and people who are now emailing me, which is very overwhelming. People who are emailing me saying, thank you, this is so great. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so much. But I think it's been overwhelmingly positive, but it's also so hard to know. It's only 2 episodes in. I have a few things in the works for later in the year in terms of partnerships or other interviews and things like that. So I guess we'll really see. It's hard to know. What
I know
other people are saying.
I know the Bellow Collective folks very well. In fact, one of the main forces behind that is a previous guest, Dana Gerber-Margie. I've had her on this show as well, and I've met a couple of the others that also contribute to that at Podcast Movement in Chicago last year. So actually, I was there, and I don't think I'm oversharing too much. I don't think I'm giving away too much, but I was sitting in a bar with several of them as they were talking about the preliminaries needed to launch that. So I love those guys. They do phenomenal work. And if you're a big podcast fan, folks, definitely subscribe. Bellow Creative, I believe they're homed primarily out of Medium right now, and as well as email-based distribution. I subscribe. I get it every week, and they do. They're just rabid. They dig deep into iTunes and find some awesome stuff, and they talk about it all the time. And so it really doesn't surprise me too much that they were able to find you, because I think that's one of the things they sort of do. They are really good about finding the best stuff and telling folks about it. So
yeah. I don't know. It was impressive.
well, that's good. Well, hopefully it's a beginning of much, much more for you. So couple questions about the future. You alluded to a little bit of it. And again, don't give away anything you don't want to, but if you've got things that you can share, do we know how long this season is? Do we know, has there been an end written yet, or is that still sort of in process? Or talk to us a little bit about what folks will hear.
Yeah, so I have a basic structure. I have an idea as to where the season will end. I think it really just depends. And I have ideas for the rest of the episodes. I'm very much someone where I work around a theme. So I have a theme for pretty much each of the episodes. And then I kind of go from there. I'm like, for this theme, do I need one about, like, do I need an interview for this? Or do I need an interview about that with my family? And do I need to do this? Like, what kind of reporting do I need to do? I am working with the idea of 10 to 12 episodes. But basically, because I'm doing this on my own, it won't be any shorter than that, but who knows if it will be longer than that. Right. But yeah, most of it is kind of in my head as I'm going along. It will still be monthly just because I do work full time, and audio storytelling is really hard to craft in a 2-week time period when you're also working full time. But the idea is kind of also I'm going to have a few bonus episodes that are kind of sprinkled throughout it as well, because I know that waiting a month for an episode can get a little tiresome and restless. And so things like extended interviews, like for episode 2, there's one about it's kind of an extended thing about Sue Ellen Hearn, who was the Akwesasne Cultural Center's museum director. And we not only talked about the people she sees coming through the museum, but we talked a lot about her own upbringing in Akwesasne, especially going through school in the neighboring towns, and having to be bussed in, and kind of the experiences she had. And so I have an extended kind of episode kind of planned and with her about her education and her upbringing there, and kind of why she came back to Akwesasne after going to college and things like that. So there will be things like that sprinkled throughout the season. But it's really hard to know. I'm aiming for 10 to 12 episodes. I have an end in mind, but how we're getting there is very much,
to be determined.
Up in
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. It's awesome to hear that 10 to 12 means, hypothetically, that most of this year there'll be regular new stuff. So that's really cool. So here's another question for you, or maybe the last question about the future. And this one's totally unfair, but only because only because we've mentioned her so many times. I'm wondering if you've even allowed yourself to think this far in advance. Megan Tan with Millennial famously had to do, I think maybe still is, when I hear her talk on Millennial nowadays, rejiggering the show season by season as she sort of shifts gears to either other people's stories or different modes and what have you. Have you even thought about, like, let's say 2018, does Good Grief come back, or book closed, or do you shift gears into one of these different pillars we've been describing that you're sort of, paying attention to, or is that just too far to even think about?
Oof. So this entire answer is going to be really vague.
Sure. No, and that's fine.
But
totally unfair.
Yeah, no, I mean, kind of. So I've thought about it. I am someone who, I am a planner. I get very anxious about things, so I tend to think about things far into the future, and then I kind of have to stop myself. I have ideas for where I can take it, whether it's about people who also deal with grief, or it's more about my own, depending on kind of how my own life plays out. Or if it's even about other Native stories or other like identity stories where people are like, how do I even come to terms with this new piece of my identity when like I was raised in this certain way? So like for me, it's like, how do I come to terms with being an enrolled Native member when I was raised white AF and I'm still white AF? And so I think I've had those ideas, but I think a lot of it, again, is just going to come back to kind of how people respond to the rest of the season and how like where I see kind of the interest going and kind of where it plays out and where it ends. And I think that kind of epiphany of like, this is the right move, kind of the epiphany of like doing a podcast in this way is the right move for me will kind of come as I'm making more episodes and kind of digging more into my own story. But I keep thinking about it. Because I kind of want to have that plan in place so it's not just like, oh, well, I guess I'm doing a season 2, but I don't really know. And maybe it'll come out in like 5 years and maybe this will happen. Like, I don't want to do that.
Right.
I'm definitely a planner. So,
well, I mean,
I don't know. It's really up in the air.
No, and the only reason I asked was really sort of the parallel with Megan because she's really shifted. She's felt the need to shift, let's say, as sort of seasons have gone on, and it's interesting because I have a feeling, like you said, you'll be facing a crossroads one way or another. And I was just curious where you were with that. So I mean, it sounds awesome. It sounds great because it's, and again, folks, there'll be a link to Good Grief and Sam's website. And I encourage you to read one of the blog posts because you talked about choosing the name. So we don't need to necessarily go down there. But what was interesting was some of the names that you chose may have been constraining for potentially the type of shift we were just talking about, right? Whereas where you landed, I think, can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I think it's an awesome name. And I think it will give you season 2, season 3, season 4 flexibility should that become a reality.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big thing in my mind, too, is that I could name it like a very specific thing, but then I get pigeonholed and then it's maybe just a little series. And it's like, how do you expand it without changing your name, which would like totally ruin a brand and like trying to sell that. So yeah, that was also something where coming up with the name was probably one of the hardest parts. But that also came out of like that Duke course where we were just thinking about our shows and our projects for like 12 hours every day for like 5 days straight. So I think at some point in my sleep deprivation, the name appeared.
Well, you've talked a lot about sort of gut instinct on things, and I think your gut is leading you in the right way because I've thoroughly enjoyed what's out there so far. I'm looking forward to what's next. So, Sam, can you tell folks where they can find Good Grief if they want to hop on the train now?
Oh, of course. So you can find Good Grief on iTunes or wherever else you listen to your podcast. So it's also on SoundCloud for people who don't have iPhones or just don't like podcasts, like the podcast app. I also have it on Overcast right now because that's my preferred listening method. And then also it's on the site at goodgriefpodcast.com for those who just want to stream it while they're like working or just on their laptops or something. And then I'm sure it's on other places, but those are the main ones right now.
Probably find it anywhere. That's right. And if people want to follow you or the show, you doing the socials? Yes.
Yes, I am. So I have my own personal Twitter. That's Sam Sabin 923 because Sam Sabin was gone. Then there's also the shows on Twitter, on Facebook. On Facebook, just search Good Grief Podcast and it will come up. It's just a page there. And then also on Twitter, it's Good Grief Podcast, but PDCST. But also if you just search Good Grief Podcast, it will come up there as well. But that's pretty much where we're at on social right now. So
that's awesome. And as always, folks, as I always say, all those links will be in the show notes. So Sam Sabin, thank you very much for taking the time to join me. It's great to talk to you.
Oh, same here. Thanks for having me.
And folks, that'll do it for episode 126. What'd you guys think? Did you enjoy that conversation with Sam Sabin? I hope you did. She's a very awesome person, and her show is excellent, and I cannot wait to see where this show is going. There's been, since our conversation, she's released another small mini episode. She made a quick comment about that in our conversation. Great stuff coming, I have a feeling, and I shared that with Sam after we were done recording. I really have a feeling that what she's doing will grow significantly in audience, and I hope that she gets some wonderful recognition for doing what she's doing because it's pretty amazing. So hop on the train now, and you can say that you were all over this early thanks to the Podcast Digest. Isn't that cool? I think it's cool. So if you enjoyed this week's show, do me a favor, guys. A review on iTunes would be spectacular. I'm 126 episodes in, and I'll be honest with you, I get a little sad when I see the review count because I know a lot of you are listening right now, and that's so awesome. And I'd really appreciate if you take just a moment. It helps the show out. People will see, oh, look at all these wonderful people who've reviewed it. It must be awesome. So please just take a quick moment, leave a review on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you listen, wherever they accept reviews. From the bottom of my heart, I really, really appreciate it. I also like to thank this week's show sponsor, Podbean. If you're thinking of starting a podcast or you're looking for a great home for your podcast, a new home, then you owe it to yourself. Check out podbean.com/TPD. You'll get your first month free if you sign up with this special URL. You get to try all of Podbean's awesome features. Again, my thanks to Podbean for their support of the Podcast Digest. Folks, that will do it. Episode 126 in the bag. 127 is coming at you next week. And the next couple of weeks, guys, are going to be awesome around here. I've got some great stuff coming up for you, and I hope you'll stay along for the ride. Subscribe, tell your friends, share the show. And until next week, for the Podcast Digest, my name is Dan Lizette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.